A passenger asked Air Canada's chatbot, "Do you offer discount for people flying to funerals?" The chatbot said yes. Book at full price now. Apply for the bereavement discount within 90 days. He followed the instructions, screenshotted the conversation, booked the flight. $812. After the funeral, he applied for the refund. Air Canada said no, we don't offer retroactive discount. You had to ask before booking. So he sued. In the British Columbia Tribunal, Air Canada's lawyers made their case. The chatbot is a separate legal entity, they said. Not our responsibility. We are not liable for what it says. And the judge rejected it. It should be obvious to Air Canada that it is responsible for all the information on the website. So it turns out Air Canada lost.
We don't know whether it was because the chatbot was hallucinating or the training data was wrong. But this is a great example of, okay, foundational governance would say, we'll know in advance what's going to break. We'll know in advance when the dashboards are probably going to be wrong or when the metrics are going to be wrong. In this case, we don't even know whether it was a hallucination. We don't know whether the training data was wrong, but the outcome was wrong, right?
Welcome to the Spark and the Forge podcast. I'm Subrata Kaur. You see, the Air Canada is not alone. 95% of the AI pilots never make it to the production. Not because AI fails, it's because governance breaks first. Malcolm Hawker saw this pattern in hundreds of conversations with chief data officers. Companies deploying AI without governance, the data it learns from. Chatbot trained on old files, outdated policies, materials sitting on servers that no one validated. And the companies that don't fail, they changed how they think about governance. Not as compliance, but as capability. Malcolm is a CDO at Prophecy. 4 years at Gartner, hosts CDO Matters podcast, just published a book called The Data Hero Playbook. What I wanted to understand, what breaks when you apply the old governance to new AI? Why is it so hard? And what are the 5% doing differently? Why governance debt compounds? 10 times the cost to fix after the fact, 100 times if you use bad data in a decision, and how Lexmark generated $2 million in additional revenue from answering one question, which is how many copiers do we have? And the paradox Malcolm sees everywhere. Good governance does not reduce data usage. It unleashes the demand. So here is what I learned. So you were the business users at some point in time asking about data and not the IT person managing infrastructure and databases. So how does that shift from user to builder change the way you think about governance?
Oh my gosh. Having been on both sides of the equation, having been the consumer and having been the builder, I tend to look at governance very, very differently than most people. Most people in the data and analytics space see governance as a control function, as a set of guardrails of who can see the data, who can't see the data. Having come from a product world, I tend to view things through the lens of customers. And we should be doing it for the customers, or we should be doing it to make the product better. I look at governance as inherently a product. Very, very kind of strict reasons why we need to do governance, but I still look at governance inherently as a product. It's a service that the data team provides to the organization. So I tend to look at it through the lens of value delivery. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? Is it delivering value? Is it making the product better for the customers? Are we building a better product because of governance? So I don't measure its effectiveness through the state of the data. I measure governance effectiveness through a better product or better customer service or a value, a business outcome for our end consumers. So it's a very different way of looking at governance.
So that's the lens Malcolm brings. Product manager, not IT person. Governance as a service, not control. Customer value over data quality. And that shift matters. For 30 years, we built governance for one thing: measurement, reports, dashboards, KPIs. The structured data in rows and columns. Everything is deterministic. You could test it. Same input, same output. But then generative AI showed up. And it doesn't fit the old model. Policy documents, handbooks, unstructured materials, nobody governed. So what breaks?
That's the elephant in the room, right? The elephant in the room is that everything that we in the data analytics function have been doing for governance for the last 30 years was built around governance of reports, of dashboards, of metrics. Everything that we do for governance is basically built around this world of highly structured data, rows and columns, right?
Yeah.
Everything we've built, our frameworks, our approaches, the way that we think about governance is through the lens of making measurements accurate. Along comes generative AI, and it doesn't run on structured data. It doesn't run on rows and columns. It runs on text. It runs on this highly unstructured data. Everything we've done is for structured data, and now along comes Gen AI. This is the elephant in the room. It's a new paradigm. It requires a new way of looking at things. It requires a new way of applying governance. In the world of generative AI, the outcomes are probabilistic, highly probabilistic, which is not the same as deterministic historically in the world of structured data. Very deterministic rules where you can largely apply governance in a vacuum because we largely know how it's going to be used. It's going to go into a data pipeline. It's going to work itself into a dashboard. In the world of Gen AI, the outcomes are probabilistic. We won't know that the data is fit for purpose until it's consumed. And I don't think we're even anywhere close to figuring out what that actually means in the world of Gen AI in this highly probabilistic world.
Tables versus text. Deterministic versus probabilistic. That's the mismatch. And Malcolm pointed out something when we were planning this conversation. So why is this so hard to fix? 4 reasons. And he laid them out. Adaptation gap. Your old governance, it was never built for ethics. Never had to be. Deterministic systems don't have ethical dilemmas. Measurement problem. You can't score ethics like you score data quality. There is no metric. Subjectivity trap. What's ethical to you isn't ethical to me. Different cultures, different values, different context. Testing impossibility. You can't test every scenario. Test 10,000 cases, production breaks on 10,001. So you can't measure it. You can't test it. You can't even agree on what ethical means. But companies still need to ship AI. Regulators still enforce outcomes. So what do you actually do? And that's what Malcolm has been watching. Some companies crash, some navigate it, and here is what the crashes look like.
We see some news stories. I think the most classic example out there was 2 years ago. Air Canada in Canada took a case all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, where somebody was chatting with a chatbot and where they got incorrect information from the chatbot related to Air Canada's bereavement policy, which is the discount rates that they would give on an airfare for people who had to travel because of a death in the family. The chatbot basically said, here's this, yes, we do give rebates, here's the cut rate, here's what you're supposed to do, go book a ticket, and then afterwards we'll give you a refund off the ticket. Well, that's not how Air Canada's policy worked, and they didn't even have a bereavement policy. But this guy said, okay, I'm going to go buy a ticket at full price. Air Canada said, that's not how it works. They took the whole thing to court. Air Canada lost. We don't know whether it was because the chatbot was hallucinating or the training data was wrong. But this is a great example of, okay, foundational governance would say, we'll know in advance what's going to break. We'll know. And this is example of, the hair. This is Gen AI. Companies are moving forward with this stuff. They are launching generative AI solutions. They are pushing these solutions into the market where they're not entirely sure what's going to break or what's not going to break.
We don't know if it was hallucination or bad training data. Think about that. Air Canada deployed a system they couldn't explain. The chatbot gave wrong information, customer relied on it, sued. Air Canada argued the chatbot was a separate legal entity. Court said, no, you are liable for what it says. Air Canada lost. And here's the pattern Malcolm keeps seeing. MDM is a tortoise. Generative AI is a hare. Everyone is chasing the hare, fast, flashy, exciting, but the tortoise keeps winning. Slow, steady, foundation first. That's the risk when you skip the foundation and chase the hare. But some companies are getting it right. They're building the foundation first, and Lexmark is one of them.
In the case of Lexmark, is one of the biggest providers of copiers on the. They implemented to solve the problem of how many machines do we have in the field. They didn't actually even have a accurate count of how many copiers they had around the globe. Once they established that foundation of truth, how many Lexmark copiers do we actually have out there in the wild? They were able to start building some predictive analytics around when those copiers were going to fail or when they were going to run out of ink. A very basic use case. Once that truth was established, they could build some predictive analytics where they knew exactly when, with reasonable amounts of confidence, copiers were either going to break so that they could send somebody out to do preventative maintenance on that piece of equipment, or when the copier was going to run out of ink and they could actually proactively go sell more ink to that customer. That use case alone drove more than $2 million in incremental revenue for Lexmark, simply by being able to answer the question, how many copiers do we have? Answering that question was foundational to allow them to say, in this case, generate $2 million in revenue.
$2 million from answering one question. How many copiers do we have? That's the tortoise winning, unsexy, boring, master data management, getting the foundation right, and then predictive analytics, proactive maintenance, upselling ink, revenue. But here is what most people get wrong about. They think governance is about saying no, blocking projects, slowing things down, control function. But Malcolm sees it different, and he just published a book about it, the Data Hero Playbook. In the book, he talks about two types of data leaders, the anti-hero and the data hero. Different mindsets, different outcomes. One blames everyone else when things don't work, and the other takes accountability and focuses on customers. So what's the mindset shift?
I was an analyst at Gartner for 3 years. And that time, I spoke to 1,500 CIOs and CDOs. In those 1,500 conversations across 3 years, I found some very, very consistent patterns. CDOs that were succeeding and CDOs that were struggling. The CDOs that were succeeding had what is known as a growth mindset, right? The CDOs that were the most successful were the ones that were innovating, that were highly collaborative, that were willing to take risks, but who put learning and development at the forefront of everything they do. The CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella, actually wrote a book about this. And if you ask Satya would say it's all about a growth mindset. And I saw that in these 1,500 conversations. The anti-hero to the data hero. So the data hero is the data leader who embraces a growth mindset. The anti-hero is somebody that embraces more of a fixed or a negative mindset, where you hear these people all the time. It's like, well, we've tried that before, it doesn't work, right? That's something called learned helplessness, where it's like, we did that before, it didn't work. Where they lean on highly deterministic patterns, all or nothing ways of thinking. It's either one thing or it's another. It's garbage in or it's garbage out. And they tend to embrace the status quo, right? But if you have one of these very defeatist, very fixed mindsets, even when you try to do the right thing, you will sabotage those efforts. From data leaders that did not embrace a growth mindset, they tended to lean on things like data literacy. Data literacy says the number one reason why companies are not getting value from data and analytics is because the consumers lack skill. If you built a new product and you took it to market and the Yelp reviews were horrible, the return rates were high, the sales sucked, what do you think that you would say as a product leader for that phone? You'd probably say, man, we miss some requirements. Or we failed to listen to our customers, or we failed to build a great product. That's what you'd probably say. But in the world of data and analytics, what we say is, oh, nobody's using the dashboards? That's because they're illiterate. Them. So the anti-hero is one who embraces an external locus of control, where they say, well, it's you that aren't using the dashboard. You don't understand data. You don't get the value of that I bring to the table. That's the pattern that I saw over and over and over and over again of CDOs that were struggling the most. They were blaming everybody else for their inability to. So data literacy is one example. Garbage in, garbage out, I think is toxic. I think that phrase is toxic. It embraces a victim mentality. And you touched on something that's foundational, which is customer driven versus data driven. Right. What I saw in companies that said that they were data driven is they were very inside out instead of outside in, or very outside in. How do we serve you? How do we make your business better? That's an outside in perspective. My success is tied to primarily your success. CDOs who struggled put data first, and it's all about the data and good data quality and best data and data pipelines and focusing on the data, making the data better. Well, that doesn't matter. If the business isn't succeeding, if the business isn't driving any revenue, then you're not succeeding.
Customer first, probabilistic thinking, growth mindset. That's the data hero. But what's the anti-hero mistake that blocks this shift? Malcolm sees it all the time. CDOs trying to govern AI, and the first thing they do, they start with a framework. Legacy framework, 25 years old, built for different era. And Malcolm says that's the biggest mistake you can make.
The first mistake that I see people fall into when it comes to governing Gen AI is they try to go and govern legacy systems. Right? What they'll say is, we need to focus on foundations. I'm going to go invest in a data governance framework. There's a lot of them out there. One of the best known ones is from an entity called Dama. It's the data governance wheel. It's 10 things that you need to do well. People say, okay, well, I need to get AI governance correct, so I'm going to go invest in that foundational framework. Big mistake. Why is it a mistake? Because there's no value in a framework in and of itself. What you should be investing in is the governance needed to drive a specific business outcome, whatever it is. Work backwards from the outcome. Don't start with the framework, particularly a legacy framework that's not going to be very good at helping you understand things like your unstructured text, right? Start from an outcome, work backwards from the outcome. What is the minimum amount of governance that I need to enable this one very specific and very measurable business outcome? These old frameworks that haven't adapted, right? The one I talked about, the Dama data governance wheel, has been around for 25 years. These old frameworks haven't adapted. Start with a framework, kind of a bottoms-up approach. Instead, we need to start from the outcome, work backwards from the outcome, take a top-down approach.
Legacy frameworks, fix-it-all strategies. Hire consultants, 6 months on a statement of work, 2 to 3 years trying to fix everything. As Malcolm says, it never happens. So what does work? Start with outcomes, not frameworks. Go outcome by outcome. And instead of measuring the data quality scores, measure business value. And that requires a specific mindset shift. But it also requires specific role.
It's something that I focus on extensively in my book. If there was only one role that I was able to hire for in 2026 or now, whenever, it doesn't matter. If I only had one incremental headcount for my data and analytics function, that one incremental headcount would be a value engineer. And it's going to be hard because you'll be under a lot of scrutiny for this. It's going to appear like it's all pure overhead because they're not making dashboards or they're not building pipelines or they're not building data models. These value engineers, their sole purpose would be to sit down with your consumers to understand how is value being driven for the company from investments in data and analytics, including governance, by the way, where this person's job would be to start estimating the value, the business value in dollars, pounds, rupees. What do those things drive from a business outcome perspective? What I would hear consistently when I was a Gartner analyst, I would tell my clients, need to go and you want to invest in data quality, you want to invest in MDM. Hey, that's great. You must put a business case together. And then they would ask how, or they would say, that sounds great, Malcolm, but that's not possible. It's not possible because the benefits are indirect. And then I would say, well, that's interesting. How does your leader of HR prove that $1 spent on an employee satisfaction program equals $1 in the bank? How does your head of sales prove that $1 in improvement in a sales process yields $1 in the bank? Nobody can. This idea of there being a one-to-one, that there must be That idea is part of the anti-hero thinking. It is absolutely part of the anti-hero thinking. It is this all or nothing. Either I can measure the benefit of that investment or I cannot, is a myth. All of our businesses run on these things called attribution models. Every business in our organization, every single line of business, marketing, sales, HR, finance, runs on these attribution models that do not rely on a causal relationship between dollars invested and dollars in the bank. Yet data leaders are out there saying, if I can't do that, well, then it's worthless. That is an anti-hero mindset. It's a deterministic mindset, and it's a myth. You can build these models. I don't think I would want to be the CDO sitting at a table where my job is measuring things. Literally, my job is measuring things where I open my mouth in front of my peers and say, I can't measure that. They would be right to say, well, wait a minute, hold on. Your job is measuring things, and you're saying you can't measure the value of investments in data. That's what you're saying. That's an integrity problem. So I would invite anybody out there who's in a senior data leadership role who may have historically believed that she or he cannot measure the business value of investments in data, to rethink that perspective. You certainly can. Now, is it going to be 100% accurate? No, it's not going to be 100% accurate. It's going to be a model. You're going to model what you think will be the improvements in your business processes. You're going to need to model, you're going to need to estimate what you think those business outcomes will be. And it won't be perfect. It won't be perfect, but it'll be better than nothing. And it is literally how our businesses run today.
5,000 hours reclaimed, $1.7 million in revenue. That's governance measured in CFO's language. Not data quality scores, not catalog completeness, actual business value. And that mindset, measuring outcomes, not activity, that's what enables companies to actually ship AI while others stay stuck. But here's the thing. Even when you do all this right, customers first, value delivery, outcome based, there is still a fundamental problem. You can't measure ethics. You can't test AI comprehensively. Yet regulators are enforcing anyway.
I think is one of the biggest reasons why we're still seeing lagging adoption. I mean, McKinsey, Deloitte, EY all say 80% plus adoption of Gen AI. But those are people using Gen AI at the desktop without any customization at all. The data I'm seeing suggests that 10, maybe 15% of companies are doing some sort of customized deployment of generative AI. But that's 10 to 15%. I talked to a handful of companies that are doing any sort of advanced Gen AI use cases. The compliance issue, the regulatory issues are very, very interesting here because I think in many ways, a lot of the regulations go beyond what is technically capable. So yeah, I think for many companies, what it will come down to is a best effort. What they will show is I've made the best effort here that I can in order to comply with your overly restrictive AI policies. I've done my best, but at the end of the day, I think a lot of this will come down to litigation. A lot of it will just be coming down to a lot of fines where companies will just pay the fines and move on. I think the most the most problematic thing here is where guardrails are reliant on AI themselves. I had an interesting conversation with the head of AI ethics and bias for IBM at a conference about a year ago now, where I asked her, I said, well, okay, ethics and bias are hard. And how are you establishing guardrails related to ethics and bias? And she goes, well, a large library of rules that we feed in as part of kind of the training for our customized models. And I said, okay, well, tell me what one of those rules look like. Here's an example of a rule. Don't make decisions based on the color of somebody's skin. Okay, that's wonderful. And something I think we can all agree on, but it's the model that is doing it, right? And where you have, it's not based on any sort of deterministic, here's, data. It is based on telling the model, don't do something dumb. Where you are used text, don't do something dumb. And then you're trusting that the model isn't going to do something dumb. And in case after case, I was asking this person, well, tell me, how are you establishing these guardrails? Well, then it's this known list of constraints that have been written out in text about the way that we want the model to behave. Avoid doing behavior X, avoid doing behavior Y. And that's great. It's great if you can quantify, at least in text, what we think ethics means, right? And I just gave one small example. It would relevant to bias as well. But again, if you're reliant on the model to make that decision and not a deterministic set of data, how can we be sure that the model is going to behave in a way that is consistent over time? I think the best that we'll be able to do is to have explainability. And this is in itself is problematic, but a huge opportunity for people who are building any of these systems. Can you look at something that the model has done and be able to fully explain why it said what it said or why it did what it did? And I think that's going to be an area where a lot of companies will simply rely on and be able to turn back to and say to regulators, here's why it did what it did. If we can do that, we'll be able to distinguish between the behavior of the fine tuning that the company did on top of the foundational model.
10 to 15%. That's how many companies are actually deploying customized AI. The rest, stuck, because they can't solve the paradox, can't measure ethics, can't test probabilistic systems, but regulations say they are liable anyway. So what do they do? Best effort, document everything, show you tried, and if something breaks, litigate, pay fines, move on. That's the reality for 85%. But here is what happens when the companies take a different kind of shortcuts. When they say, we'll add governance later, and the debt compacts.
The first time I ever tried to implement a governance program was a publicly traded company that was reporting finances to Wall Street. Under the covers, couldn't actually answer the question of how many customers do we have. So they were pulling their customer accounts out of their ERP system where revenue was getting recognized. The ERP system was in essence a system of record. That's what they used for their financial reporting. However, if you asked anybody outside of the CFO, how many customers do we have, they couldn't really answer. That was the outcome of years and years of governance debt, of years and years of systems-based debt, of architecture debt. Infrastructure debt, where they had been investing in silo without any focus whatsoever on making sure that data could be shared across those systems. I was brought in as a consultant for this company, and my SOW said, "Help us understand how many customers do we have." And I was like, "This is a publicly traded company." Giant company. They're using the best BI tools that money could buy. This is gonna be easy. I'll do a few dashboards. I'll do a few reports. I'll show them how many customers that they have, and I'll be done. Well, I found that there was all these years of governance debt, of infrastructure debt. It turned out to be a multi-year engagement to try to answer that question because they had grown through merger and acquisition, and they'd never fully integrated any of the companies that they had acquired over the years. They had all of these multiple ERP systems, multiple CRM systems. The first time I ever actually turned on an MDM system to answer that question, we pulled data from all these systems, dropped it into a single hub. We did what's called entity resolution. So you Acme Inc., Acme Co., Acme LLC. We got to a single consolidated number. I was able to answer the question, how many customers do we have? And I put it in front of the CEO, and within minutes, I was told, turn it off. Well, what do you mean, turn it off? I'm thinking I'm going to get consultant of the year because I'd solved this problem that it taken forever and ever and ever to solve. And we started to distribute these customer 360 dashboards. We started them all over the organization. I'm thinking, and we had to turn it off. And the reason we had to turn it off was because we had thought forever and ever that customers didn't traverse lines of business. Let's just say there's 3 lines of business. There was a salesperson assigned to line of business 1, a salesperson assigned to line of business 2, and a salesperson assigned to line of business 3. We assumed that the customers did not cross those lines. They did. There were customers across all of them. Now, all of a sudden, salesperson 1, you say, oh, Acme is my customer. And Acme is buying product 1, product 2, and product 3, and I want commission for all of them. And they were only getting commission for one sale, and that was happening with every salesperson. So it turns out that providing the visibility basically broke our sales organization because now all of a sudden everybody wanted pieces of other people's compensation. They wanted the commission check. It took us a year to fix that. And the data wasn't wrong. The data was perfectly accurate, but our business processes that we had built around this data and under the assumption that data is not being shared broke. So we had to go completely realign our compensation model and more of a kind of a sharing model where we acknowledged that customers were crossing lines of business where in the previous we had assumed that they hadn't.
So this fixing the data errors, if you choose to do that, it will multiply exponentially over the years, maybe 10x.
Exactly what we saw. We didn't even know that we were paying them incorrectly. So, and that's one example of things multiplying years over year over year. Now, a friend of mine, his name is Tom Redman, also known as the Data Doc. He created something called the Rule of 10. And what Tom will tell you is that fixing something after the fact, what Tom would say is that it costs 10 times as much to fix it after the fact. That's Tom's rule of 10. So you've got incorrect data in a report. If that data is used to make a decision in a downstream system, then there's another 10. So that would actually end up costing you 100 times as much if you actually did something in an operational system based on that incorrect data. So yeah, the data debt, governance debt is very, very real. So instead of saying we need to go solve it all, what you should do is go outcome by outcome by outcome. Fix the problem for one specific business process. And the one example I was giving was sales compensation, but there are many. There are probably hundreds in your organization. This is a mistake that I see CDOs make over and over again. We've got all this data debt, we've got all these problems, we're horrible at governance, issues galore. We're going to go fix it all. And they will spend the next 6 to 8 months coming up with a statement of work, and then we'll spend the next 2 to 3 years fixing it all. What you need to fix is use case by use case, outcome by outcome, be iterative, keep things in the smallest bite-sized chunks that you can and still drive value.
Turn it off. That's what the CEO said. 3 weeks turned into multi-year. Malcolm finally got the answer. Put it in front of the CEO, turn it off. Why? Because customers cross business lines. Salespeople wanted commission on overlapping accounts. The data wasn't wrong. The business processes built on bad assumptions, those broke. Tom Redman calls it rule of 10. Fix it after the fact, 10 times the cost. Use that bad data in a decision 100 times. And here is what happens when you don't take shortcuts. When you actually get governance right.
Gartner says that 80 to 90% of all data in companies is unstructured. The world that I just described has mostly been focused on the world of measurement, on the world of dashboards and KPIs, which is great, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. If we can figure out how to make that data, all of that unstructured data, if we can add context to it, if we can add quality to it, if we can make it easy to access, if we can make it consistent, if we can make it predictable, if we can make it observable, meaning we can explain why these systems work, how they work, we do all of those things, we will induce demand. We will experience something called Jevons paradox, which is we will start to induce the demand of that data, and then we'll want more and more and more and more of it. It's just like a construction project. Maybe you've seen these construction projects where they widen a road, go from 2 lanes to 3 lanes. 2 lanes, completely congested, open it up to 3 lanes, within a week, it's congested again. That's what we will see in this data management layer. If we can expose that, AI is going to want more of it. And the more we want and the more we have, the more we will differentiate. And the more we do it, the more we'll want, because the more value will be delivered.
More governance, more demand. That's Jevons paradox. Most CDOs think opposite. They think if we govern data properly, people will use less of it. Less chaos, less mess. But actually, the opposite happens. Make data accessible and context, make it predictable. Suddenly, everyone wants more. AI wants more. Analytics wants more. Operations wants more. A good governance doesn't constrain demand. It unleashes it. And that connects to where Malcolm sees the CDO's role is headed. Because if CDOs can't deliver this, if they can't enable AI, can't drive value. Companies create a new role.
Well, there's things that I see and there's things that I want. The things that I see are the fragmentation. I see AI officer being separate from a data officer. To me, that makes no sense at all. Right? It makes no sense at all. But I'm seeing it, and the reason why I'm seeing it is because companies want to derive value from AI. They want their companies to transform. They want to automate their business processes. They want to drive shareholder value from AI, and they're turning to the CDOs. The CDOs aren't getting the job done. So then a new role is created. Okay, well, fine. We won't rely on the CDO to do that. We'll go create this new chief AI officer. And now the chief AI officer is going to go get it done. Well, maybe not. Optimally, what I would want to see is a CDO, not CDAIO, not CDAO, CDO, Chief Data Officer. Analytics, I would argue, is a data use case. AI, I would argue, is a data use case, all under the umbrella of the CDO. Where I want to see the role go is Chief Data Officer at the table. One of the peers of the C-suite, right? How does that happen? If you take a growth-centered mindset, if you become that data hero that I talk about in my book, if you focus on product management and the relentless delivery of value, putting your customers first, if you put growth and development first and foremost before anything else, right? Put the customer at the center of what you do, you figure out AI, you be very agile, you figure out a way to make small and incremental changes, right? You do those things. The culture of the organization will come along. You will change the culture. What I see right now is way too many CDOs saying, okay, we don't have a data-driven culture. I need to change the culture. Well, good luck. Satya Nadella, who I would argue is one of the best CEOs on the planet, has been at it 10 years, and he would tell you that's how long it takes to change a culture. If you're a CDO that says, I need to change the culture before I can succeed, you're not going to change the culture. You need to figure out ways to succeed now. Culture change is a multi-year endeavor. Find ways to drive value now. Be iterative, drive value, embrace a growth mindset, put the customer at the center of everything you do. You will become that CDO that I was talking about. There won't be a chief AI officer because you'll have figured out AI. There won't be a chief analytics officer because you'll have figured out analytics because they're both data use cases. This is the future that I wish to see for CDOs, and I hope we get there in the next few years.
That's the vision. Growth mindset, customer first, CDOs who figure out AI. But here is the reality that most are facing right now. Air Canada's chatbot gave wrong information. They argued that it was a separate legal entity. Court said no. They lost. That's where the most companies are today. AI making decisions at scale using data that never governed, and they're liable for what it does. So what did Malcolm surface in this conversation? Don't start with frameworks. Start with outcomes. Work backwards. Legacy frameworks like DAMA will haven't adopted. Fix it all strategies never happen. Go outcome by outcome. Lexmark couldn't answer how many copiers do they have. Implemented MDM. Generated 2 million additional revenue from one question. Hired a value engineer. Quantify business value in CFO's language. Dollar, not data quality score. The pharmaceutical case, 5,000 hours reclaimed, 1.7 million in revenue. Know the rule of 10. Fix after the fact, 10 times more expensive. Use bad data in a decision, 100 times. Governance debt compounds. Recognize G1 paradox. Good governance doesn't reduce data usage. It creates more demand. Widen the road. Within a week, it congested again. Customer driven, not data driven. Data heroes measure success by customer outcomes, and anti-heroes blames user for not understanding the dashboard. These aren't prescriptions. They are things that Malcolm seen work. Test them in your context. But here's the question that's still sitting with me. If you can't measure ethics, can't test probabilistic system comprehensively, but regulators hold you liable anyway. So what do? Only 10 to 15% of the companies are deploying customized AI, and the rest stuck on this exact paradox. So if you are a CDO, a data leader, a AI product manager wrestling with this, share this episode. Send it to your team, someone else dealing with the same tension. And if you want more conversation like this, practitioners who have done the work, ideas you can test, then hit subscribe. I am Subrata Kar. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.